Hey, I'm Chef D. Not only do I love serving food, I love being around a table. I love a great conversation, and I love finding out more about people, what makes them who they are. So join me at the kitchen table with me, Chef D. Hey, it's at the kitchen table with me, Chef D. I have a really, really special guest with me today, Jess Milton, backstage at the Vinyl Cafe. Jess and I go back a couple years. We were just sharing off air, folks, is that just kind of remembering when we first started the catering for the bands for Chef D. And Jess, I think it was around 2011 where we did it was 2 nights in Kitchener. And I was just admitting, because I want to go backstage, because you guys are doing backstage behind the Vinyl Cafe. Backstage with Chef D. We did Kenny Rogers. Sorry, we did BB King was the first ever, like at Center in the Square, where we were the actual caterer. We did Pat Benatar, and then we did Kenny Rogers, and then we did this guy named Stuart McLean.
Hey, did you know the show before, or had you ever heard of us or no?
Trish, my wife, did, but I did not.
Oh, that's kind of fun.
And I'm going like, who's Stuart McLean?
Yeah.
And those who know my wife has a really big personality, and she's amazing, and she'll talk to anybody. But she was like starstruck when she first got to meet Stuart, and that. And the cool thing about you folks, and I want to bring it to the kitchen table first, is that the importance of it to Stuart was that everybody ate at the same time, like from merchandise to technical people to your band to yourself, because you were making things happen. And I know with other tour managers, they might eat at 8 o'clock at night, but it was really important that he had everybody at the table. Was that a big thing for him?
That was huge. And it came from 3 places. It's amazing. First of all, I should say my little dog here. Luckily, my children are not home here, but my dog might make an appearance. So if you hear her
That's
barking,
okay.
If you see me distracted, Molly the dog is here, who was also on the road often. So that came from 3 places. The first place it came from is we had an amazing promoter named Don Jones, or Jonesy, and you probably remember him, larger than life character, larger than life human being too. And he was a real road warrior. He toured with everyone from like Alice Cooper to Stuart McLean to Anne Murray. He just kind of, most big Canadian acts, he did that. A lot of acts on the road do per diems or buyouts. So they'll give you, you'll get $25 for dinner, and everyone goes their own way. It's very efficient. And certainly as someone who managed a lot of the caterers, I can see the appeal. Not everyone is as amazing as you. But something, that was not his thing. He always said, first of all, some people will pocket that money, right? Some people, and I was certainly like this when I first started out, I could have really used that $25 a day. And therefore I would just go to I would have pocketed 20 of those $25 and spent $5 on a veggie sub or something like that, and would have been hungry and therefore grumpy and not my best self. And so it leads to splintering, and it leads to people not really investing in good quality food, which might affect their performance. And so he came at it from that angle, like kind of a technical angle. Stuart and I came at it from a different angle. We just loved getting people together. I love cooking. I love having people around a table. I love parties. And so that pause in the day where we all came together before we, of course, came together to put on a show. I mean, you witnessed hundreds, thousands of these shows, not just ours, but at the Center and the Square and other places, I'm sure. There is it's a collective experience, and it's exhilarating. It can also be really stressful. And that time around before a show, things could be going really well, or they could be not going very well. And to take half an hour to kind of pause and come together as a team is hugely important. And it's something that was really, really important to us. So it's cool that you saw that and recognized that we did that. I know it's unusual, and it was, I think, a big part of why our little touring family felt like a family, because we sat down together every single night.
100%. And that's truly what it was, Jess.
Mm-hmm.
And looking back, and we have the benefit to be able to do this is that looking back, it was a family, it was a family. And we were part of, when we were with you folks, it was
Absolutely.
part of the family.
Yeah. I mean, look at us, right? Like we haven't seen each other. I don't know. Well, yeah, I remember you came when I did that thing at CBC, which is so sweet. But I mean, and here we are, like, whatever, like 7 years later, 6 years later, still hanging out. Like you absolutely were a part of that. That's partly a huge part of because who you and Trish are, though, too, and what you're like as people.
When we found out, and we found out through you folks, through other folks in the industry, how crappy the food was on the road, I made it my mandate that you were going to get the best food if it was like you were coming either to my house or either to my restaurant, and we marketed ourselves that way, and it just became such a passion, and just I loved being that fly on the wall and just listening. And just listening in, because part of me is you're doing I'm doing what I truly love doing, and then listening to the band, or the Good Lovelies, for instance, just amazing band and amazing people, and just what they're dealing with on the road, with families and stuff like that. And it was amazing time, and it still is. It's still, like I just said, we're catering a bunch this week, and it's still like you go down there and you go, and I love the smiles. I love when people come down. So what got you into doing what you did with Stuart? Like, you were with him for about 15 years?
Yeah, about that. Yeah. So if Stuart were here, he would get so excited by that question because he loved telling the story that I'm about to tell you. And he loved the incredulity that would strike me when he told this story. So Stuart, I went to Ryerson, or it's now called Metropolitan University, for journalism school. And in my last year, I had Stuart as a teacher. I was a really good student. I worked really hard. And by the time I got to fourth year, I was already working full time. I was interning on the National and working at a sports television station at night. And so I was kind of on my way. And of course, I knew who Stuart was, and I knew the Vinyl Cafe. It was already on the air. And I had him as a teacher, and he was not the right teacher for me. So he loved telling the story because I always started the story, and I was like, yeah, he was a horrible teacher. And he was like, well, you were a horrible student. I was like, what are you talking about? I was like the straight A student. But I know exactly what he was talking about. He was an excellent teacher, but not for a student like me. He wanted to help students who really needed help. And so I felt a little like I wanted more, but he didn't want to bother with kids like me. He wanted to bother with, he sort of struggled through school. So he gave so much attention and love, really, and support to students who really needed it. And so we were not a good pair, to the point where he wanted to hire someone. David Amer, the former producer of the show, and Stuart were the only two full-time employees, and they needed someone very part-time. I like to joke that I owe that first job, and therefore probably my entire career, to one single overflowing email inbox, because email had just been invented. It was 2003 and 2002, I guess. And they couldn't deal with it. There was just too many emails, and they were like, do we answer everyone? Like, what do we do? And so they wanted a part-time help. So Stuart was like, okay, I'll ask one of my students to work part-time. I was not his first choice. His first choice turned him down. And this is the part of the story that he loves telling. He's like, you were such a bad student. I didn't want to hire you. I went to a bunch of other people first. Like, you're like my last choice, which is true. I was. But when he finally made it down to the bottom of the barrel, he approached me. He and David Amer approached me for this job as a production assistant. And it really was, I might have been his last choice, but this job also was not particularly appealing. It was, answering mail and answering email and that kind of thing. And it was, I think, 3 days a week, 6 hours a day, or like 2 days a week full-time. So it was, not even a full-time job. But I already had these other gigs. I worked overnights at the sports television station. I was interning on the National, and I bartended at a yacht club. So I was kind of like, yeah, sure, I'll do this a couple days a week, And And I really liked, I did really like Stuart, and I really liked David. I remember the first meeting I went to at Stuart's apartment where we put a show together, or I watched them put a show together. And I remember the feeling like they just kind of hung out and talked about music and talked about whatever was on their minds. And I'm like, you could get paid for this job? I mean, if you call it getting paid, I think I got paid like $8 an hour or something. But yeah, and that was that. And so they brought me on, and I worked part-time for about a year doing that kind of work. But very quickly, Stuart started throwing things at me, like throwing things, he'd have crazy ideas. And I'm an enthusiast. So he'd throw a ball up in the air, and I would like leap up and catch it. And, he liked that about me. And so over the next year, I started taking more and more on. And then David Amer retired, and I took over as producer.
And so your first trip on the road, like on truly on the road, like, was that intimidating, or was it like, because you just said, you liked jumping in and that enthusiasm, was it that, or was it like, oh, what am I getting myself into?
Well, that's a really great question. And believe it or not, no one's ever asked me that. So I think if I did that now, it would be intimidating. But I was really young. Like, I was too young to know, and too inexperienced to know how in over my head I was, and and it's like, this is I had my children later in life, and I always say, like, this is the problem. Like, I knew exactly at a certain point, all my friends had their kids 10 years, and I was kind of like, oh God, this is whereas if you have your kids when you're younger, you kind of don't, you just like romanticize it, right? So whereas I was fully aware of what I was getting into. With the show, I was just so young and so naive and so green that it wasn't intimidating to me. And I was super confident. I've always been.
Oh, yeah, 100%. You knew who was in charge.
Yeah, I just have that vibe. And so, like.
And it was a good vibe. I'm not saying that as a bad vibe. You need structure in anything we do, but it was just, you knew that Jess was. Yeah.
Oh, thank you, I guess. I guess I probably didn't start like that. I mean, I came into a show and a touring family that was fully established. When I first came on, we didn't even change the musicians. It was the exact same musicians for every single tour. So this group at the time, it was much smaller. Back in those days, would have been 2003, my first tour. We traveled in a motorhome, and there were only, in a motorhome. Really intense. I guess there were 7 people on the road, and then, as you know, by the end, we had like we had our own bus with bunk beds, and we had a separate, and we had a trailer or a van with all our gear and our set and stuff. So, but yeah, when I first got involved, it was just a motorhome, and it was the same band every single time. So in hindsight, it should have been intimidating, and I guess it was a little bit. I didn't have a job, right? Like, in fact, I don't think I was even paid for those first few tours. Like, I just kind of had to look around and see what needed to be done. And sometimes I got that right, and sometimes I got it horribly wrong. I remember one time I saw all these boxes full of CDs and stuff, and they were on stage. And I'm like, well, the show's going to start in half an hour or an hour. I better get these boxes back into the bus. And Ted Decker, you probably remember Ted. He did all our merch. He was like, what happened to all that merch? I'm like, don't worry, Ted. I put it back in the bus. He's like, Jess, that's for sale. Like, we can't have it in the bus. So I had to like go back out to not the bus. I guess it would have been the motorhome or the van or whatever we had on that tour. So it was. And I remember like I just didn't know anything. I think I was wearing heels that first tour. Like I had these heeled boots and like a dress. Like, it's crazy. By the end, of course, I was just, I just had like 6 black t-shirts and jeans and sneakers and really got my act in gear.
But don't we, again, kind of looking back and learning by mistakes. You said, you've made some, and Lord knows I've made mine. But I don't think we'd be where we are today as rounded. And that is if we didn't make those, right?
Absolutely.
And, and that's, you pick up the piece. And I think a lot of times people want it to be given to it like right now. And no, you need to go through those mistakes to be that much better. And
you're absolutely right. But I think, I don't know a lot about what it was like when you were starting out, but it was a very safe place for me to make mistakes. And so I agree with everything you said. And I encourage mistakes because that's how you learn. And it's also how you, especially when you're a creative, right? Like, you have to try things, or I do. That's how I create. Yep. I don't, it's funny. I'm such a planner. when it comes to, well, almost everything, but when it comes to writing and like visionary stuff and creating shows and experiences and feelings, I don't plan anything out. For the podcast, when I go to figure out what to say on that show, I don't plan it out at all. I just sort of sit down and pay attention to what's in my heart and in my tummy. It sounds so cheesy when I say it out loud, but it's truly what happens. I don't there's no structure to it. But I think I remember reading this book once by, I can't remember her name, but it was about creativity, and there was different chapters written by different people. And there was a chapter written by a principal ballerina from, I want to say, Spain. And she talked about the role of structure in her life and the yin and yang to structure and creativity. And it really rang true to me. It was when I was sort of first starting out, like 2004, this idea that she had created a highly structured life so that when she needed to be free and explore her creativity, if she was free and had no structure, then she would never feel the feeling of freedom. Like sometimes you need to bump up against something to know when you're not bumping up against something. And that's what I'm like. So I'm about to start writing some of these podcasts, and day to day, especially with kids, my life is quite structured. And so I need to go to this like mental space. And I sometimes even go to a physical space. Like I'll leave, this is my office where I do most of my work, but I'll go to a different room in the house or go out. We have a little yoga studio thing. I might go up there, or go to a friend has a cabin up north. I might go up there to really get out of the routine and regularity of my life, because I need that freedom sometimes to create. And yet it's funny, like when I didn't have kids and I had more freedom, I couldn't get to that place as efficiently or as quickly, maybe because I knew I could go there whenever I wanted. And now it's like, oh my God, like I only have 4 hours to do this. I got to get in the zone fast. It's kind of neat. Anyway, I don't remember how the heck I got there from whatever question you asked.
But that's amazing. And it's so true. Okay. So favorites, and you probably get asked this a million times, and I apologize, but favorites, okay. I know my favorite story, and I'll tell you
What's
that in
yours?
A minute. Boy Wanted.
Oh, well, for obvious reasons. And for people who don't know that story, it's a story that takes place in Harmon's Fine Foods, which is a really, what a strong sense of place. Like Stuart really created that place out of his brain, but it feels so real to me. And Mr. Harmon feels so real. He's the
right. You could smell the store in him telling that story, And when he talks, and when I was thinking about doing our podcast and talking with you today and thinking more about that story, and when he talked about putting the sea salt on the tomato, you just know how that tastes,
Yeah. So evocative for sure. I love that story too. I love a lot of the Sam stories. My favorite story. It's funny. I should have like a canned answer ready for that one, and I kind of don't. It sort of depends on the mood. So I love Hello Monster.
Yes.
It's a really different story.
Yeah.
And I know that I love it because I remember what I was doing. Stuart used to call me and read the stories when he was done for the most part. And I'd read them on the page, obviously, too. But when he was excited and feeling good about it, he often would want to tell it, right? And so he would call me to tell me the story. And I remember I was walking my dog when he called me to tell me that, to read me that story. And I remember almost being paralyzed. Like I couldn't keep going. I was so into the story. I remember where, exactly what the weather was like and where I was and everything. It was a really special story and a very, very different one. He wrote it right after his father died. And I think he was trying to work out some things there. And anyway, it just reminds me of it kind of.
That's one of Trisha's favorite stories.
Yeah. Well, you know what's interesting? Like she knew Stuart. It's a lot of people, like a lot of us who worked with him or loved him. That's a lot of people who knew him. That was it's a story that really feels like the Stuart that I knew and loved. It's not particularly funny. Like there's some funny moments in it, but it's very, there's a lot of heart in it. And so it's like my version of Stuart, I guess. Yeah. So I like that. But then there's some lines and some other stories. So I love Christmas at the Turlingtons for like a barn burner funny story. It's one of my favorites. Such a good one. I mean, there's so many incredible parts. And it was one of the first like Christmas stories that I really worked on. I think it was my second year. And it was just was a great tour. Like, so a lot of the memories of that tour are feeding into my feelings. But there's also a line at the end of that story. There's two stories that I love, but I think I might love them because there is a line in them that perfectly captures what I think we were trying to say with the show. So there's a line at the Christmas in the Turlingtons, and for people who don't know the story, it's a hilarious story.
Yes.
That one's probably my favorite. It's just very, very funny. It's well crafted, and there's little lines, like little funny lines, but also just the conceit of it, like the structure of it is hilarious and really well done. But there's this line at the end. So basically, the basic premise of the story is Dave and Morley end up spending Christmas at Mary Turlington's, and Mary Turlington is, like kind of a uptight accountant who lives next door. So she is the antithesis of Dave, and she's sort of his. I won't call her a villain, but she's certainly a nemesis. And Dave, of course, is trying to help out, but in trying to help out, his heart's in the right place, but his feet are hardly ever in the right place. But he makes a lot of mistakes, and they're hilarious. And in the end, Mary is on the phone. And, she's like this night that she imagined went horribly, horribly wrong, and she calls her sister to debrief with her, basically to complain. Mm-hmm. But as she's talking, something interesting happens. She starts almost mythologizing the night already, which is an amazing coping mechanism. But it's also like you start to see that she realizes maybe it wasn't, it was bad, but it was funny bad. And she's already started to forgive Dave. And I can't even remember who says it, if it's Bert or her sister, but the line is, family and friends, they sure mess up our lives. And Mary smiles but kind of laughs, and she says, yeah, they sure do. And I'm getting emotional just saying it, because it's sort of, life is messy, but the magic is often in the mess. It's hardly ever like when things go right that you remember them. It's often, and it's hardly ever the big moments, right? Like it's hardly ever like the 40th birthday party or the meticulously planned Christmas dinner. It's the smallest, tiniest little thing that you remember. It's like just this morning, I gave my kids watermelon for breakfast, and Eloise, my eldest, who's 5, said to me, can you do that thing you did where you cut it in half and turn it into a bowl and put it back inside? And that is some little thing I did. Like, I had to even remember what she was talking about. It was 3 years ago. She was 2, and I just did it on a whim. Who knows why? And 3 years later, she remembers this thing that was nothing to me, right? And that's sort of, I think, how life often works. It's hardly ever the big moments. It's usually these little micro moments that matter. And it's often the messiness of life where the magic can be found. And that's why I love that story. I mean, it's hilarious too, but it has that almost thesis statement that it's hard to remember sometimes to live like that. And I like to be reminded, and Stuart was so good at reminding us.
He loved this country we call Canada, and you guys got to see the vast majority, or all of it, actually. And just listening to him in the stories and even describing where you folks were, food did play a very important part in not only, like what we've talked earlier, but it was important to Stuart to have a good meal.
Yeah, hugely important. But he loved food, but he was also very conscious of his health. And so food is really related to that. And, it's funny, like we were on the road about 150 days a year. And so we ate more meals out than we did at home. And that sounds really luxurious and fun, but it's, I'm going to sound like a total spoiled brat here. It can be a bit oppressive. Like it's, food can be comforting, and but also like it can wreak havoc on your health. I remember my dad traveled a lot. He is a sports reporter, and I remember when we traveled with the Blue Jays when I was a kid, and his health really was impacted in a negative way because he was he had no control over what he was eating, and we knew a lot less about nutrition in the 80s than we do now. So so Stuart he cared a lot. He loved food and he loved cooking. But he also cared about his health and was very aware of how the impact that the food he ate made, not just he didn't care about how he looked. He cared about how he felt, and also longevity. And so Yeah, I think that performance is part of that too. Like, you know how you eat, like just the other night I ate, my kids love pasta, as so many kids do. And I ate I mean, it was a heck of a meal if I do say so myself, chef. It was delicious, but it wasn't like, it didn't make me feel great, you know?
Yep.
And so it was so good. And then later that night, I was just like, I was trying to go back to work after the kids got to bed and I couldn't focus. And I was like, right, of course, like I'm just feeling not my best self because my body was processing what I ate. So that was a huge part of it for Stuart as well. But you're right. He loved food, and he loved like food across the regions in Canada and how those things were different and stuff.
Oh yeah. It was amazing. I know our time's getting short, but I just want to say a big thank you for coming on and rekindling some of the thoughts I've had over the last little while. And I'd love to have you back on later down the road.
Anytime. And, I want to say thank you to you for years of great meals, but also for, you know, love can be felt through food, you know, and we felt that. Like, we felt how much you cared about your work, and it made us feel good. So thank you for that.
It was really, and it still is to this day, really important. I'm a people pleaser, and I love seeing people smile.
Well, you made all of us smile so many times. So thank you.
So, Backstage at the Vinyl Cafe, where can we find that podcast?
Pretty much anywhere you get podcasts. So, you know, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, any of those places. And it's also just on our website. So if you're not someone if you're new to podcasts, as many of our listeners were initially, you can just stream it right from vinylcafe.com. And there's a whole bunch of my dad had never listened to a podcast. Sorry. My dad had never listened to a podcast, and we recorded all these videos with him of how to listen. So they're all there.
Because he wrote for the Hamilton newspaper, didn't he? I remember that. And now, because you said that, it was at Hamilton Place that I met him. Yeah.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, Hamilton Spectator. He still does. He's 75 years old and still writing every day. Yeah.
That's amazing. Well, Jess, thank you so much. Continued success. Thank you for bringing back those great stories, those great memories. And we'll talk to you further on down the road, young lady.
I look forward to that. Thank you.